Peace be upon you. As explained in the last episode, atheists attributed innate phenomena to material, genetic causes without any evidence. But they didn't stop there. They even attributed actions, which are not from innate nature, to genes, and used this as a pretext for justifying such actions as natural phenomena. A striking example is their handling of sexual disorientation, which they do not call sexual disorientation, but rather homosexuality. As the word disorientation implies, reprehensible behavior that's inconsistent with human nature, which they do not admit. There is a link between homosexuality and irreligion. A 2013 survey of the U.S. LGBT sexually disoriented community showed that about 50% had no religious affiliation, much higher than the 20% of the U.S. general public with no religious affiliation. The Western scientific community, where atheism and Darwinism are common, published studies on the link between sexual disorientation and genes, and on the social phenomena related to sexual disorientation. One example is a study on how a child adopted by two homosexuals is impacted by the adoption. We have the right to ask, were these studies conducted in a scientific and unbiased manner? This leads us to the more important question: is scientific research, which has ideological and ethical implications, and which is produced under the dominance of Western liberalism, is it really unbiased? Or is it, sometimes, a politicized tool? If such studies present results which contradict some Islamic values, is the rational position to doubt the Islamic values or the validity of these studies? When an atheist says, "I believe in science," is this true? Or does he believe in the false interpretations of pseudoscience which lead to compounded ignorance? This is the prime and most important goal of our episode. Sexual disorientation is just an example through which we will examine the credibility of this Western science. Our roadmap for this episode will be as follows. Please focus, dear viewers, so that we don't get distracted. The episode is full of benefits, evidence, and important facts, so we need to focus to understand the sequence of its elements. We'll start by analyzing the meaning of the hypothetical phrase, "Homosexuality has a genetic cause." Then we will cite what is currently reported by leading Western sources on the link between homosexuality and genetics. After that, we will return to the most important question: are the reports by Western references and studies on such ethical matters necessarily credible? We will answer this question by examining three things. 1. The research environment. Does it encourage free research, or does it practice licensed terrorism? 2. Are the researchers credible, or are there some indications of their lies and bias? 3. Who funds this research, and how does that impact the results? Then we will see how the media deals with the research findings, truthfully or otherwise. First, this vague sentence: homosexuality has a genetic cause. What does it exactly mean? Does it mean that a homosexual has genes that involuntarily push him, her towards homosexual acts? Just as someone blinks in reflex when a foreign body enters his eye, or when he involuntarily withdraws his hand from a hot object? Of course not. Does it mean, then, that a homosexual has genes that make him psychologically attracted to people of the same sex? Upon investigation, this is the meaning of their phrase. So let's first assume that these genes do exist. What's the justification for using them as an excuse for disoriented behavior and an exemption from condemnation and punishment? This is a very important key point. Let us assume that a person does have a distorted feeling. Does this justify his behavior according to this feeling? For example, what if a man has an excessive lust for women? Does this lust justify rape? Or is he required to restrain himself, control his lust, and channel it to permissible outlets, i.e. lawful marriage? So why do you use headlines like, "Homosexuality is subject to genetics," in a way that implies that the homosexual is forced by his genes into abnormal behavior? Are you ready to commit to the same logic in dealing with political and intellectual opponents who might have genetic reasons for doing what they do? If we say, a polygamous man may have genetic reasons for taking multiple wives, and the woman who agrees to be the wife of a married man might be genetically compelled to do so. So, why is gay marriage legalized in all 50 U.S. states? Through the June 26, 2015 Supreme Court decision, while polygamy remains illegal in all 50 states. To date, why is the claim of a genetic link used to elicit sympathy for homosexuals specifically? Regardless, are there really genes that can cause psychological disorientation and desire? This brings us, dear viewers, to the second focal point. What leading Western references currently report on the relationship between homosexuality and genetics. A prominent American scientific and professional organization, American Psychological Association, concluded that there is no proof of a genetic basis for homosexuality to date, despite the fact that this association strongly defends what it considers LGBT rights. Moreover, several specialized books on the study of sexual behavior describe the research as inconclusive, i.e., it hasn't reached any conclusion, and that no specific gene has been linked to homosexuality. One of the best books in this domain is Dr. Neil Whitehead's book titled, My Genes Made Me Do It: Homosexuality and the Scientific Evidence, which disproves the link between homosexuality and genetics from a theoretical, fundamental, and logical perspective. Moreover, he reviewed the studies on identical twins in the area of homosexuality, many of which show no genetic link, and identified the major scientific errors in the twin studies, which claim that a link exists. We'll list some details in the comments section. The book is an interesting scientific read for those familiar with the basics of scientific research. Here, dear viewers, please note an important fundamental issue. Atheists say, we came through mutations and natural selection of the traits that serve survival, and the extinction of those who carry traits that do not serve survival. Does homosexuality help survival? Of course not, because couples of two males or two females cannot produce children. Consequently, they don't transfer genetic traits to future generations. And so the law of natural selection should have ended homosexuality, as it is a trait that does not serve survival. Yet, homosexuality exists. Note how, in the materialistic Darwinian explanation, the beginning contradicts the end. Back to the conclusions of the American Psychological Association and the specialized books. Please note that we're not following the unscientific methodology used by many, of using any study that suits their whims and ignoring other studies that do not serve their perspective. Instead, we are citing the conclusions of major health organizations and specialized books, as they provide a summary of a large number of related studies. Despite all of this, someone will say, in contrast to what you say, there are studies that indicate a relationship between homosexuality and genetics. Yet another will say, if, one day, the main references change their standpoint, will you admit that this relationship exists? This brings us to the third and most important focal point of this episode, which is to address the question, are scientific studies, which produce results geared towards serving liberal Western values, are they really unbiased? Or are they a politicized tool? We will answer this question by studying three things. First, the environment in which this research is conducted. Does it encourage free research or apply licensed intellectual terrorism? The Western civilization raises slogans for their sacred concepts and criminalizes and fights those who dare to challenge them. The influential LGBT lobby was able to include, as one of these sacred concepts, so-called LGBT rights. And just as anyone who opposes Western dominance is accused of terrorism, and anyone who criticizes Jews is described as anti-Semitic, similarly, opposition to homosexuality is labeled homophobia. That is, homosexuality is a natural phenomenon, a human right, and whoever opposes it suffers from a sick phobia towards it. But this sick person has no excuse. Instead, he's criminalized. And just as there are slogans for anti-terrorism and fighting anti-Semitism, Western civilization raises the slogan of anti-homophobia, for which the United Nations adopted, launched campaigns, issued agreements signed by many countries, and appointed a special UN investigator, all to protect homosexuals. In such an environment of militancy and censorship, is it realistic to expect science to produce unbiased results? One of the scientific scandals that answers this question is Professor Spitzer's story. Professor Robert Spitzer, who is considered to be the father of modern psychiatry, published a study on psychotherapy to help homosexuals overcome their homosexuality. He called it reparative therapy, i.e., a treatment to repair sexual disorientation. In the study, he reported success in his treatment to correct the sexual disorientation of 200 homosexual men and women. This infuriated health organizations, and they attacked his study. Although Spitzer was a supporter of homosexual rights and had worked to remove homosexuality from the APA's list of psychiatric disorders, this did not help his case before the scientific community. Thus, in 2012, Spitzer apologized for his study, and the media reported the news as follows. Psychiatry giant sorry for backing gay cure. At the end of his apology, he said, with abject humiliation, "I believe I owe the gay community an apology." You can imagine the pressure that Spitzer was subjected to when you know that the two largest international health organizations attacked his treatment, the World Health Organization, WHO, and the Pan-American Health Organization, PAHO, and issued, on May 17, 2012, a report titled, "Therapies to Change Sexual Orientation Lack Medical Justification and Threaten Health. How does psychotherapy, based on verbal counseling with the homosexual person, threaten health?" According to their report, repression of sexual orientation from such treatments has been associated with feelings of guilt and shame, depression, anxiety, and even suicide. The report concluded with recommendations on how to fight homophobia. I ask you, dear viewer, to listen to these recommendations and tell me what they remind you of. The 5 recommendations state: 1. Conversion or reparative therapies and the clinics offering them should be denounced and subject to adequate sanctions. 2. Public institutions responsible for training health professionals should focus on training them to accept homosexuals and to eliminate any attitudes of pathologization, rejection, and hate toward non-heterosexual persons. 3. Prevention of interventions aimed at changing sexual orientation. 4. In the media, homophobia should be exposed in any of its manifestations and expressed by any person should be exposed as a public health problem and a threat to human dignity and human rights. 5. Civil society organizations can develop mechanisms of civil vigilance to detect violations of the human rights of non-heterosexual persons and report them to the relevant authorities. What do these recommendations remind you of? They seem identical to anti-terrorism recommendations, don't they? Yet another dogma imposed on the scientific community. That reminds us of the show, Expelled, which reveals how they oppress and exclude any scientist who rejects Darwinian evolution, a terrorism reminiscent of the Spanish Inquisition and the tyranny against science practiced by the Church in the Middle Ages. After all this, I think it is very comical for anyone to believe that the environment of scientific research on homosexuality is free and unbiased. The second question when considering the credibility of Western research on homosexuality is, are the researchers credible, or are there indications of their lies and bias? We will present some evidence in response to this question. First, the research that atheists and homosexuals continue to hail. Dean Hamer's 1993 study, which claimed a possible linkage between the DNA marker, XQ28, and homosexuality, as published in Science magazine. Remember, dear viewers, that Dean Hamer is the same person who claimed the existence of a God gene and wrote a book about it without any evidence or published research, and whose claim was rejected by geneticists as in the previous episode. Let's examine the validity of this other claim from the father of unproven claims, Hamer. One condition for the credibility of scientific research is the reproducibility of its results. In other words, if other researchers repeat the same experiment, they must obtain similar results. Otherwise, a researcher can claim anything he wants and become a great discoverer based on false claims. This experiment of Hamer and his team was repeated by many other researchers on larger numbers of homosexuals, yet none of them got similar results. So, they dropped hints to discredit Hamer and his alleged gene. One example is the study by Dr. George Rice and his team, published in Science as well. It states, "It is unclear why our results are so discrepant from Hamer's original study. Because our study was larger than that of Hamer et al., we certainly had adequate power to detect a genetic effect, as large as was reported in that study. Nonetheless, our data do not support the presence of a gene of large effect influencing sexual orientation at position XQ28. Simply, this discredits Hamer on this, just as he was discredited on his claim of a God gene. Decades have passed. during which many attempted to reproduce Hamer's results, without any success. This is added to the important issue discussed in the previous episode, which is that modern genetics refutes the claim that there is a specific gene for a specific behavioral trait, as in this 2008 study published in Nature, which concluded that, after sequencing the human genome, most of the simple physical traits were too complex to be linked to a single gene or even a specific set of genes. So, how about behavioral traits, which are much more complex than physical ones? So Hamer's gene is ridiculous from a theoretical standpoint, as in the Nature study, and discredited from an empirical view, as in Science, the two most famous naturalistic journals. Additionally, it is discredited by more than a quarter centuries worth of scientific research which failed to reproduce Hamer's results. We present another issue on the researcher's credibility by reviewing the characteristics of those who research gay parenting. More and more U.S. states have legalized adoption for same-sex couples, male or female, allowing them to adopt and raise a child, and expose her to their relationship on a daily basis. The presentation of the case for adoption includes references to scientific studies on the effect of such adoptions on children. The writer David Benkoff surveyed tens of studies on gay parenting and published his well-documented research under the title, "All the Gay Parenting Studies Are Flawed." Benkoff stated that, through his survey of these studies, he found that at least 60% of researchers who produce results that support gay parenting are gay themselves. He also stated that he couldn't find data on the sexual orientation of 25% of the remaining researchers, i.e., they might be gay as well. The writer mentions a list of names and incidents that support his claim. He notes that it is enough to prove their bias, that they don't disclose this fact in the conflict of interest section, the section in scientific papers, where the researcher lists any factors that may impact the objectivity of her research. Of course, a scholar has no right to publish a study casting doubts on the validity of research conducted by gays on the basis that they are biased by their homosexuality, as she will be accused of homophobia and become a target of anti-homophobia campaigns. No wonder then that many published studies will conclude that gay adoption has no negative impact on children. Furthermore, this study conducted by Dr. Gartrell, a lesbian married to a woman, concludes that children raised by lesbians were rated significantly better socially than their age-matched counterparts who have heterosexual parents. Scientific research published in scientific journals and welcomed by scientists in scientific communities. What would you expect from such communities when they publish studies on polygamy, for example? Would their results be unbiased and credible? Especially when you know that polygamy is illegal in their countries. Moreover, some studies, like this one, published in a journal affiliated with Cambridge University, show that children raised by gays are much more likely to be gay themselves. How can they be homosexual and have children? The homosexual may be bisexual and beget children by marriage, or through a heterosexual affair, alongside their homosexuality. Or this child was born out of wedlock, abandoned as a foundling, then adopted by the gay couple. This is the liberal civilization. Again, research shows that children raised by homosexuals are more likely to acquire homosexual behavior themselves. Homosexual researchers do not consider this to be a problem at all. For atheists, if parents tell their child that God created the world, it would be an ugly abuse of childhood innocence, as Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion. But atheism has no problem with raising children on homosexuality, and does not consider that an ugly abuse of their childhood. Here, we may ask, whether the Western culture truly leads to personal freedom. Imagine a child, up for adoption, raised by two gay men. The child grows up to be gay as a result of observing his gay parents. Then he feels that his homosexuality is incompatible with his human nature and wants to adjust his psychological inclinations so that his sexual disorientation no longer causes him psychological distress. However, the health organizations step in to say, any intervention aimed to change individuals' sexual orientation shall be prevented, as in the aforementioned 2012 report, meaning it is forbidden to provide any treatment for this homosexual. Instead, he should stay as he is. Is this freedom or indoctrination of immorality? Another story concerning the researcher's credibility is that of Professor J. Michael Bailey, who received U.S. government funding to conduct studies examining arousal in homosexual men and women by exposing them to gay porn videos, using measurement methods too indecent for words, to the extent that his research was blasted in the Washington Times as a waste of American taxpayer dollars. In Islam, knowledge and hadith are received only from a credible ethical person, whereas in this Western pseudoscience, there is no check for the scientist's ethics and credibility. It doesn't matter if he is the most immoral person, or even an atheist who rejects absolute moral values. As we discussed before, for whom fraud and forgery are relative matters that cannot be considered absolutely wrong. Bailey's story takes us to the third point to consider when questioning the credibility of Western research in the field of homosexuality, research funding, and its effect on the results. In Benkoff's aforementioned article, where he surveyed tens of studies, he provided evidence that the funding for some research that supports gay parenting came originally from well-known homosexuals, like David Bonnet, and LGBT advocacy organizations like the Rainbow Endowment. A known phenomenon in the scientific community is the tendency of a scientific study to support the interests of its financial sponsor, known as sponsorship bias. In other words, imagine a homosexual giving money to a researcher and telling him, "Conduct a study to determine if what I do is good or bad, and here's your paycheck for my money." How can scientific integrity survive this? The article also noted that as of March 25, 2014, there were 150 studies on gay parenting. Of course, dear viewers, every study costs hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, and many are funded by U.S. federal government funds, as well as the LGBT community. We have a right to ask, would the U.S. government or its institutions support research on topics like the effect of raising girls on values of decency and modesty on their mental health? Another point related to funding concerns the publication of the results. This is where the problem of publication bias comes in. In other words, if a homosexual researcher came up with results contrary to his own inclinations and to the inclinations of his financial sponsors who promote homosexuality, would the researcher publish his results or hide them? Likewise, if a truly unbiased researcher came up with results against homosexuality, there is no guarantee that his research will be published in scientific journals. Instead, they may refuse to publish his research, especially since the LGBT lobby and its supporters launch campaigns against every research which produces results that they don't like. It's easier for journals to avoid the headache of being labeled as homophobic and replicating the tragedy of Robert Spitzer, who was forced to apologize in the end. Our last focal point. How does the media deal with the results of such research? Well-known U.S. media organizations and their affiliates who promote their agendas in the Muslim world jump at studies that appeal to gays, despite their falsehood and fabrications, as discussed before, and add their own fabrications in the titling and headlines, as shown. An example is how the media seized on Hamer's claim of a gene linked to homosexuality and promoted it widely. This was meekly criticized in a scientific publication, stating that the results of Hamer's study were never reproduced. Regardless, the media treated Hamer's claim as an indisputable fact. International media outlets, such as The Telegraph, decades after the study's invalidation, still blatantly accuse those who oppose homosexuality of ignoring science. This science of Hamer's study. It's not only the media. Even the scientific community behaved unscientifically when it added the discredited gay gene, theoretically and practically, to the biomedical databases of the 21st century. In conclusion, we have a right to ask, after all this, is everything that atheists praise science or pseudoscience? Liberal sanctities driving specific results, biased funding, a drive to produce results that appeal to the sponsors, homosexual and non-credible researchers, errors in designing studies, publication bias, terrorizing anyone who dares to oppose the whims of homosexuals, campaigns against homophobia, and media which selectively accepts what studies to publish and exaggerates by claiming that the alleged link between genes and sexual orientation means that a person is forced to be homosexual. Then the atheist parrots say, "I believe in science. Darknesses, some of them upon others. When one puts out his hand therein, he can hardly see it. And for whomever Allah makes no light, then in no way can he have light. Quran translated meaning 2400 hours 40. Before we end, dear viewers, every live heart will feel the darkness after hearing this evidence of the collapse of innate nature. Hence, we would like to enlighten our hearts with the call of revelation by reciting verses from Surat al-Shuara that describe the state of Prophet Lot, peace be upon him. As the sin of sodomy first appeared in his people, he called them, saying what can be translated as, "Must you, unlike other people, lust after males, and abandon the wives that Allah has created for you? You are exceeding all bounds." Quran 26, 165 to 166. Lot, peace be upon him, didn't need to prove, at length, the blatant sinfulness of their action. Most of Lot's call to his people was not faith-oriented. Rather, he was primarily concerned with correcting their humanity. However, but they replied, "Lot, if you do not stop this, you will be driven away." So he said, "I loathe what you do. Lord, save me and my family from what they are doing." We saved him and all his family, except for an old woman who stayed behind. Then we destroyed the others and poured a rain of destruction down upon them. How dreadful that rain was for those who had been forewarned. There truly is a sign in this, though most of them will not believe. Your Lord alone is the Almighty, the Merciful. Quran translated meaning 26:167-175. Throughout this episode, one wanted to say, would atheism and Darwinism justify crimes such as murder or rape based on the existence of genes driving this behavior, as they justify homosexuality? Yet, I did not raise this question, because the modern answer to it, in atheism and Darwinism, is, yes, we do. If we hadn't taken up your time already, I would have told you the story of the warrior gene, which some criminals can now add to their defense case to reduce their punishment, based on scientific research, as happened with Bradley Waldrop. I would have also told you about Dr. Thornhill and Palmer's book, which justifies rape as normal genetic behavior, and for whomever Allah makes no light, then in no way can he have light. Quran translated meaning 2400 hours 40. This was an example of the transformation of science into an instrument to serve governing values, and an example of the decline of materialists when they denied innate nature and explained human behavior from a purely materialistic perspective. Peace and mercy of Allah be upon you.